The gunshots started before anyone understood what the shouting meant. Sunlight filled the diner like it always did at that hour, warm, harmless, almost lazy. Outside, traffic moved in slow afternoon lines. Inside, plates clinked. Coffee steamed. Someone laughed too loudly at something that wasn't very funny. Zariah Cole stood behind the counter, posture straight, white uniform sharp against the chrome and glass. One hand rested lightly on the edge of the surface. The other hovered near a clean plate she had just set down. Then the door burst open. 3 masked men rushed in, weapons raised. The first shot cracked through the room, splintering glass somewhere behind her. Everyone reacted the way people do. A man dove under his booth. A woman covered her head with both hands. Chairs scraped violently across tile. Someone screamed. Zariah didn't move. Not when the second shot fired. Not when a robber shouted. Not when a table flipped. She didn't look at the gun first. She looked at the hands holding it. The grip was wrong. Too tight, too desperate. The barrel trembled in small, involuntary shifts, left, right, correcting itself like it didn't trust its own aim. He wasn't steady. He was scared. In the corner booth, Woo-Jin slowly lowered his coffee cup. His expression didn't change. It rarely did. But something behind his eyes sharpened, not at the sound of gunfire. At her voice. "You should walk away," Zariah said quietly. The robber hesitated. And for the first time in years, Woo-Jin forgot to breathe. Because he knew that voice. And the woman he had searched for across continents was standing 10 feet away, pretending she belonged behind a counter. Woo-Jin had spent years training himself not to react. Men had aimed guns at his head before. Rivals had tried to poison him at his own table. He had negotiated ceasefires while knowing half the room wanted him dead. His face had never betrayed him. But her voice did something violence never could. It moved through him, like a memory he had buried alive. Calm, low, controlled. Not raised to match chaos, not sharpened by fear. The same cadence that used to steady rooms, far more dangerous than this one. The robber in front of her shifted again, trying to reclaim dominance. "You talk too much," he muttered, though his words lacked conviction. Zariah tilted her head slightly, studying him the way one studies a miscalculation. "You're not here to shoot anyone," she said softly. "You're here because someone told you this would be easy." Woo-Jin's fingers tightened imperceptibly against the edge of the table. That wasn't a guess. That was assessment. And it was precise. The sound of her voice peeled back years he had tried to seal away. He remembered a different room, different weapons, different stakes. He remembered standing beside her while men twice their size waited for permission to breathe. He remembered the way she could disarm a situation without lifting a weapon. He had searched for that voice across cities, across borders, through informants who lied and allies who betrayed him. And now it stood 10 feet away, in a white diner uniform. The robber laughed nervously. "You don't know anything about me." "I know you've never done this before," she replied. "Your safety's still on." The young man blinked. Confusion flickered through his posture. He glanced down instinctively. Woo-Jin didn't miss the detail. He almost smiled. She hadn't moved. Hadn't lunged. Hadn't reached. She had simply watched. And spoken. The robber corrected the safety too quickly, embarrassed. His fingers slid back to the trigger, this time angrier. But anger born from humiliation was unstable. Woo-Jin rose slowly from his booth. Not abruptly, not threatening. Just enough. The room felt the shift. One of the other masked men noticed him and swore under his breath. The way Woo-Jin carried himself, the tailored suit, the unhurried movements, didn't match the rest of the room's panic. Zariah didn't look at him again. But he saw it. The smallest tightening at the corner of her mouth. She had recognized him too. Not surprise. Not fear. Recognition. And something else. Restraint. She was choosing not to move yet. The young robber took another step closer to the counter. The muzzle of the gun hovered inches from the polished surface. "You think you're smarter than me?" he demanded. "No," she said. Her eyes held steady. "I think you're being used." The words landed harder than a threat. And Woo-Jin understood the truth before the robber did. This wasn't random. And neither was her survival. The voice he had been chasing for years hadn't just resurfaced. It had been summoned. The room felt smaller now. Not because of the guns. Because of the silence between breaths. The young robber tried to steady himself, adjusting his stance the way he'd seen in movies. Feet apart, arms extended, jaw clenched. But his wrists betrayed him. The barrel quivered in tight, nervous arcs. Not enough for the panicked customers to notice. Not enough for his partners to call him out. Enough for Zariah. Her eyes didn't follow the weapon. They followed the tremor. It wasn't just fear. It was inexperience layered over adrenaline. His shoulders were too high, locked near his ears. His breathing too shallow. Every inhale lifted the muzzle a fraction upward. Every exhale dipped it down. A rhythm. Uncontrolled. Predictable. "You don't want this to be your first," she said quietly. He flinched. Not at the words, at the way she said them. Measured, personal. As if she were speaking to him alone, not the room. "Shut up," he snapped again, louder this time, glancing sideways to make sure the others still believed in him. Behind him, one of the masked men was stuffing bills into a bag with impatient movements. The third kept his gun sweeping erratically over the customers, trying to look intimidating. None of them were professionals. They were loud where professionals were quiet. Fast where professionals were patient. Woo-Jin saw it too. But he wasn't watching the robbery. He was watching her. The way she shifted her weight slightly onto her back foot. The subtle adjustment that widened her balance. The near-invisible flex of her fingers against the counter's edge. Muscle memory. The young robber stepped closer, trying to regain ground. The muzzle now hovered inches from her collarbone. "Empty the register," he ordered. Zariah didn't reach for it. "You're sweating," she observed instead. His breathing hitched. A bead of moisture slid from beneath his mask, down the edge of his jaw. "You've been outside for a while," she continued, calm as a quiet afternoon. "Working up the nerve." "How would you know that?" he demanded. "Because if you'd planned this properly, you wouldn't be shaking." The insult landed. His grip tightened too tight. His trigger finger curled inward, not fully committed, but enough. Zariah watched the tension gather in the tendons of his hand. She saw the tiny spasm in his index finger before it happened. Before he even felt it. The gun jerked. A shot cracked into the ceiling instead of her chest. Plaster rained down. Someone screamed again. The robber stumbled backward half a step, startled by his own mistake. And in that split second, in that humiliating, exposed heartbeat, Zariah knew. He wasn't just weak. He was afraid of himself. Woo-Jin felt the shift in the room like a current changing direction. The most dangerous thing about an amateur wasn't their skill. It was their unpredictability. And the young man with the shaking gun had just realized he was losing control. Not of the diner. Of himself. Zariah didn't smile. But something in her gaze hardened. She had found the fracture. And fractures could be widened. Plaster dust drifted slowly through the sunlight, turning the air hazy and unreal. The young robber stared at the smoking hole in the ceiling as if it had betrayed him. His chest rose too fast beneath the dark fabric of his jacket. The other two men swore, their movements sharpening with irritation. Control was slipping. Woo-Jin rose from the booth. Not abruptly, not with drama. He simply stood. The motion was quiet, but it changed the geometry of the room. One of the robbers noticed first. His weapon shifted toward the man in the tailored black suit who did not look afraid enough. "Sit down," the robber barked. Woo-Jin adjusted his cuffs. It was a small gesture, deliberate, unhurried. His face remained composed, but his eyes were no longer distant. They were calculating, not the robber's movements, but the distance between the nearest gun and Zariah's throat, the line of sight from the second man near the register, the reflection in the window that revealed the third's blind spot. He had entered this diner to pass time. He had not intended to intervene. But he had also not intended to find her. The young robber swung the barrel back toward Zariah, desperate to reassert authority. His humiliation burned hotter than fear now. "You think this is funny?" he shouted, voice cracking. "No," Zariah said again. She hadn't shifted from her spot behind the counter, hadn't looked startled by the misfire, but she had seen Woo-Jin stand. Their eyes met briefly. No greeting. No shock. Just acknowledgement. He understood the message in that glance. Not yet. The robber closest to Woo-Jin stepped forward, trying to close distance before the suited stranger became a problem. "I said sit down." Woo-Jin didn't raise his hands. He didn't argue. He simply turned his body slightly, angling himself between the robber and the counter without making it obvious. A subtle repositioning. A barrier. The movement was so smooth it barely registered as defensive. Zariah noticed. Of course she did. The young robber's breathing grew ragged again. He was unraveling faster now, pulled between fear of failure and fear of losing face in front of his partners. Woo-Jin studied him with detached precision. This wasn't a coordinated strike. This was a test. And tests were designed for one thing: observation. The robber near the register finished shoving cash into his bag and glanced toward the door as if expecting something else. Reinforcements. A signal. A clock ticking down. They were on a schedule. Which meant someone had sent them. Woo-Jin's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Zariah had been found. The robber in front of her lunged forward suddenly, grabbing a fistful of her apron to yank her across the counter. The room gasped as one. Woo-Jin's composure cracked, not in his face, but in his stance. He stepped forward. Not as a customer. Not as a bystander. But as a man who had decided. The distance between him and violence disappeared. And for the first time since the door burst open, the robbers were no longer the only predators in the room. The robber's fist tightened in the fabric of her apron, dragging her forward just enough to wrinkle the clean white lines across her waist. The gun in his other hand hovered too close now, the tremor in it magnified by anger. Up close, his fear was easier to see. His pupils were blown wide. Sweat clung to his upper lip beneath the mask. His jaw worked like he was chewing on something he couldn't swallow. Zariah didn't struggle. That was the first thing that unsettled him. Most people clawed, screamed, bargained. She simply let the fabric pull taut between them. "If you fire that close," she said evenly, "you'll rupture your own eardrum." He blinked. The statement wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a threat. It was clinical. "You think I care," he snapped, but his voice cracked on the last word. "I think you care more than you want them to know," she replied softly. Behind him, one of the other men barked something impatient, but the young robber didn't respond. His attention was locked on her now, trapped between fury and something dangerously close to doubt. Zariah tilted her head slightly, studying him the way someone studies a fragile mechanism. "You weren't supposed to shoot," she continued. "You were supposed to scare." His grip tightened reflexively. She felt it in the fabric. "You didn't plan for the noise," she added. "You didn't plan for how it would feel." The words landed with precision. His breathing faltered. Because she was right. He hadn't planned for the recoil, for the heat in his palm, for the way his finger betrayed him. "You don't know anything about me," he said again, but the defiance was thinning. "I know you're not the one in charge," she answered. That did it. His gaze flickered sideways, just for a second toward the robber near the door. Confirmation. Woo-Jin saw it too. The fracture widened. Zariah lowered her voice further, forcing him to lean closer to hear her. They told you this would be simple. Quick in, quick out, no resistance. His mask shifted as he swallowed. They didn't tell you who might be inside. Silence pressed into him. The other robbers were growing restless, but he couldn't look away from her, couldn't step back without admitting weakness. You don't have the stomach for this, she said, not cruelly, just truthfully. And they know it. His finger twitched again on the trigger. But this time, it wasn't from fear of her. It was from the dawning realization that he was expendable. You're being tested, she finished quietly. Not me. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The gun dipped a fraction. Just enough. Woo-Jin shifted his weight, reading the moment. The young robber's control was unraveling, not because she threatened him, but because she exposed him. Zariah hadn't raised her voice, hadn't touched him. She had simply rearranged the power in the room. And the most dangerous thing about a man with a gun wasn't always the weapon. It was what he believed about himself. Right now, that belief was crumbling. The shift was almost invisible. But everyone felt it. The air in the diner seemed to compress, tightening around the counter where Zariah stood, and the young robber held the gun inches from her chest. The other two masked men had stopped shouting. The customers had stopped moving. Even the sunlight felt thinner, filtered through dust and tension. The robber's grip on her apron loosened, but his pride wouldn't let him step back. Instead, he adjusted. He brought the gun up properly this time, not wavering near her shoulder, not drifting toward the ceiling. Direct. Centered. The barrel pointed at her heart. The room narrowed to that single line between steel and fabric. Woo-Jin took one slow step forward. Not enough to provoke. Enough to calculate distance. The young robber noticed the movement and snapped the gun toward him for half a second, then back to Zariah, as if reminding himself who this confrontation was truly with. Stop talking, he ordered, breath ragged beneath the mask. Stop acting like you know me. Zariah's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes sharpened. I don't need to know you, she replied quietly. I just need to know what you'll do next. His finger tightened again. This time, not from humiliation. From panic. Because she was no longer destabilizing him with insight. She was predicting him. And prediction felt like control. The robber inhaled sharply, overcompensating. His shoulders lifted, his elbows locked too stiff. The gun steadied for a fraction of a second, steadier than before. He was forcing it now. Forcing composure. Forcing authority. I will shoot you, he said, and this time the words landed heavier. There was no crack in his voice. Only desperation. Zariah saw it. The tipping point. Fear had burned into something more dangerous, the need to prove himself. Behind him, one of the other robbers shifted nervously. Just grab the money and go, he muttered, sensing the fracture widening beyond their control. But the young one didn't move. Because now this wasn't about the robbery. It was about her. The gun pressed closer. Close enough that the metal nearly brushed the fabric of her uniform. A single flinch from her would have satisfied him. Just one. But she didn't give it. Her breathing remained even. Her hands stayed, resting lightly against the counter. She looked at him, not the weapon but him. And in that gaze was something worse than defiance. Understanding. You don't want to shoot me, she said softly. It wasn't a plea. It was a statement. And the certainty in it was unbearable. His finger began to pull. Slowly. Not a twitch this time. A decision. Woo-Jin's body coiled before his mind gave permission. The room contracted to a single heartbeat. And in that suspended second, before the trigger could break, everything changed. The trigger began to give. Not a jerk this time. A choice. Woo-Jin moved, but not the way the room expected. He didn't lunge across the tiles in reckless heroics. He didn't shout. He didn't draw attention. He stepped into the robber's blind angle, the narrow slice of space the young man had forgotten existed. At the same time, Zariah shifted. It was so subtle most of the room missed it. Her weight dropped a fraction lower, her left shoulder angled inward. The hand resting on the counter slid just enough to brace. The gun fired, but not where it had been aimed. The sound cracked through the diner, deafening in the enclosed space, but the bullet buried itself harmlessly into the metal frame beneath the counter. Because Zariah had already moved. Her right hand snapped up, not toward the barrel, toward his wrist. 2 fingers pressed sharply against the inside joint, where nerves ran shallow beneath skin. The effect was immediate. His grip spasmed open. The gun slipped. Before it could fall, Woo-Jin's hand closed around it with clean efficiency, twisting it free and stepping backward in one fluid motion. No wasted force. No flourish. Just removal. The young robber stared at his now empty hand in stunned disbelief. Zariah didn't let him recover. She pivoted inside his space, one controlled step forward, one firm palm against his sternum. Not violent, precise. He stumbled back into a chair that had already been overturned, legs tangling awkwardly. The air left his lungs in a sharp gasp. The other 2 robbers reacted too late. One raised his weapon toward Woo-Jin, only to freeze as the cold mouth of his own gun met his temple instead. Woo-Jin's voice was quiet when he spoke. Don't. It wasn't a threat. It was certainty. Outside, tires screeched. Black vehicles had pulled to the curb without anyone inside the diner noticing. The door opened again, not with chaos, but with measured entry. Men in dark suits stepped inside, silent, disciplined. They moved like shadows filling empty space. Within seconds, the remaining robbers were disarmed, restrained, pressed to the floor. No shouting. No panic. Just containment. Dust still floated lazily in the sunlight. The customers remained crouched, stunned into silence by how quickly the storm had shifted. The young robber on the ground looked up at Zariah, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. You, he started, but whatever accusation he meant to form died in his throat. Because she wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking at Woo-Jin. He held the confiscated weapon loosely at his side, eyes fixed on her with something far more dangerous than anger. Recognition. The room had survived. The robbers had failed. But something irreversible had just happened. Zariah had stopped pretending. And Woo-Jin had stopped watching. Now they were both standing in the open. No guns between them. No masks. Only the past they had tried to bury. The last of the robbers was lifted to his feet and guided toward the door. The suited men moved with quiet efficiency, their presence absorbing the remaining panic in the room. Customers began to rise slowly, as if waking from something unreal. Zariah adjusted her apron. Not because it was necessary. Because it gave her hands something steady to do. Woo-Jin handed the gun to one of his men without looking away from her. His jacket fell smoothly back into place as he took a step forward. Then another. Each step measured, controlled, closing the distance that years had stretched thin. They stopped an arm's length apart. For a moment, neither spoke. The diner hummed faintly again, a refrigerator motor clicking back to life, someone whispering in shock. But around them, the air felt sealed. "You're alive," he said finally. His voice was lower than before, not the voice he used in negotiations, not the one that commanded obedience. This one carried something unguarded. Zariah met his gaze without hesitation. "So are you." A pause. His eyes moved briefly over her uniform, the counter behind her, the ordinary world she had wrapped around herself. "You chose this?" he asked. "I built it," she corrected gently. He absorbed that. The sunlight caught the sharp line of his jaw, but it was the stillness in his expression that betrayed him. He had expected anger, or accusation, or at least surprise. He had not expected calm. "You disappeared," he said, not accusing, stating fact. "Yes." The word landed without apology. A flicker of something crossed his face, not hurt, not quite, something deeper, a fracture he would never allow anyone else to see. "I looked for you," he continued. "I know." That made him blink. "You knew," he repeated. "I know how you operate," she said softly. "You don't let things go." A faint exhale escaped him, almost a laugh but not quite. "And yet," he said, "you thought you could." "I didn't think," she replied. "I hoped." The honesty of it settled between them. One of his men approached quietly, murmuring something about the police being notified, about cleaning up the scene. Woo-Jin dismissed him with the slightest movement of his fingers. His attention never left her. "This wasn't random," he said at last. "No," Zariah agreed. The certainty in her voice confirmed what he had already calculated. "They were sent," he added. "Yes. For you." She didn't answer that immediately. Instead, she glanced briefly toward the door where the robbers had been taken, then back at him. "They weren't expecting me to be here," she said. "They were expecting someone else." His eyes sharpened. "Someone who thought I was still gone," she finished. The implication hung heavy. The past hadn't just found her. It had been searching. Woo-Jin stepped slightly closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You can't stay here now." It wasn't a command. It was inevitability. Zariah looked around the diner, at the overturned chairs, the cracked ceiling tile, the shaken customers. At the fragile life she had constructed. Then she looked back at him. "I know," she said. And this time, there was no pretending otherwise. The police sirens were still distant when the diner began to empty. Customers slipped out quietly, guided by men in dark suits who knew how to keep stories contained. Broken glass was swept into small piles. A temporary calm settled over the room, thin as paper. Zariah stepped out from behind the counter. For the first time since the gunshots, she was no longer shielded by it. Woo-Jin watched her cross the tile floor, her movements still measured, still composed. The white of her uniform was smudged now with dust from the ceiling, but she wore it like armor. "You shouldn't have stepped in," she said without looking at him. "You would have handled it," he replied. "Yes." He didn't doubt that. "That was why," he added. She stopped near the window where sunlight struck the floor in sharp rectangles. Outside, one of his cars idled quietly. "They used the diner," she said. "Daylight, civilian space, amateur faces, it wasn't a hit." "It was a signal," he finished. She nodded once. A memory flickered between them, not spoken but shared. A warehouse years ago, a similar test. A rival syndicate probing weaknesses by sending disposable men first. Back then, she had been at his side. Not in white. In black. "You train them to look scared," she said quietly. "I train them to survive," he corrected. "And to sacrifice whoever was necessary," she replied. His jaw tightened. "That includes me," she asked, not accusing, just clarifying. "You were never expendable." "But I was useful." Silence pressed in. The truth had always lived between those two words. She turned toward him then, fully. The sunlight caught the calm in her eyes, the same calm that had once steadied entire rooms of armed men. "I left because I saw where it was going," she said. "Where?" he asked. "You were building something that couldn't survive mercy." He didn't flinch at the accusation. "I never asked you for mercy." "No," she agreed. "You asked me for loyalty. And you gave it. Until I couldn't." The weight of that hung heavier than the gunshots had. "There was a list," she continued. "Do you remember?" He did. Names marked for removal. Allies who had become liabilities, a restructuring that required blood to reset balance. Her name hadn't been on it, but someone close to her had been. "I told you I would handle it," he said. "You would have," she replied, "and that was the problem. Because he would have done it cleanly, efficiently, without hesitation. And I would have stood beside you," she added. That was the truth she had run from. Not fear. Participation. "I didn't leave because I was weak," she said. "I left because I knew I was." The sirens grew louder now. Woo-Jin studied her, as if recalibrating something fundamental. "You think walking away made you ordinary?" he asked. "No," she said softly. "I hoped it would make me harmless." Outside, the first patrol car turned the corner. Woo-Jin's voice lowered. "They found you anyway." Zariah held his gaze. "Yes," she said, "they did." And this time, neither of them pretended that the past could be outrun again. The police lights washed red and blue across the diner windows, turning the bright afternoon into something fractured and unreal. An officer stepped inside, scanning the room with procedural caution. Statements would be taken, reports filed, the event reduced to paperwork and bullet points. Attempted robbery, suspects apprehended, no civilian casualties. Clean. Contained. Temporary. Zariah stood near the counter as questions floated around her. Her answers were measured, minimal, harmless. Yes, they came in shooting. Yes, they demanded money. No, she didn't know them. All technically true. Across the room, Woo-Jin spoke quietly with one of the officers. Polite, controlled, a respected businessman who happened to be present. His men blended into the background, invisible unless you knew how to look. The life she had built fit together like this. Small, predictable, manageable. Early shifts, quiet customers, evenings alone in a modest apartment where no one knocked unexpectedly. No bodyguards. No coded calls at 2 a.m. No blood on polished floors. She had convinced herself that simplicity was safety. But simplicity had just shattered under gunfire. The young robber's words replayed in her mind. "You're being tested. Not random. Not desperate. Directed." She stepped behind the counter one last time and looked at the cracked tile above where the bullet had struck. The ceiling would be repaired, the glass replaced. The diner would reopen. But it would never be anonymous again. Neither would she. The owner approached her hesitantly. "Zariah, are you all right?" She offered a faint smile, the kind that reassured other people. "I'm fine," she said. But fine was not the same as safe. Outside, Woo-Jin's car door stood open. He didn't call to her. He didn't pressure. He simply waited. Because he understood something she was only now allowing herself to accept. They hadn't sent professionals. They had sent amateurs to confirm a rumor. And the rumor had just been proven correct. She was alive. And if she stayed here, the next visit wouldn't be clumsy. It would be final. Zariah untied her apron slowly. The fabric slid through her fingers, light and familiar. She folded it once neatly and placed it on the counter. A small, ordinary act. It felt heavier than the gun had. This life had not been a lie. It had been a choice. But it had always been temporary. She walked toward the door without looking back at the tables she had wiped 1,000 times. At the coffee machine, she could operate in her sleep. The police were still outside. The city still moved. The world hadn't ended. It had simply shifted. Woo-Jin watched her approach, his expression unreadable but his eyes alert. "Are you leaving?" he asked quietly. Zariah glanced once at the diner behind her. "My peaceful life ended when they walked through that door," she replied. The words weren't bitter. They were clear. She stepped past him toward the waiting car. Not as a waitress. Not yet as a queen. But as someone who understood that running had only postponed the inevitable. This wasn't a return. It was a collision. And she was done pretending she didn't see it coming. The car door closed with a soft, decisive sound. Not a slam. A seal. Zariah sat back against the leather seat as the city began to move past the tinted windows. Afternoon light flickered across her face in measured intervals. Storefronts, traffic lights, shadows from overpasses. Familiar streets she had walked 100 times now looked distant, as if they belonged to someone else. Woo-Jin sat beside her, silent. He did not fill the space with strategy, did not issue instructions. His men followed in the vehicles behind them, forming a quiet convoy that did not attract attention but could not be mistaken for ordinary. "You don't have to do this," he said at last. It wasn't manipulation. It wasn't a test. It was acknowledgement of choice. Zariah looked at her reflection in the darkened glass. The white uniform was still on her body, dust smudged at the collar, fabric creased where the robber had grabbed her. She reached up and slowly unfastened the top button. "I already did," she replied. He studied her profile, the calm set of her jaw, the steady rhythm of her breathing. Years ago, that composure had stood beside him in rooms where men twice their age waited for permission to speak. She had never needed to raise her voice to command silence. "You left because you thought I would become something you couldn't stand beside," he said quietly. "I left because I knew I could," she answered. That was the truth. She had not been afraid of him. She had been afraid of herself. The car turned onto a quieter road. The skyline shifted from low buildings to steel and glass. A different world. Woo-Jin's world. "You were right," he said after a moment. "I did become ruthless." "I know. And you're coming back anyway." Zariah's gaze remained steady. "I'm not coming back for the Empire," she said. "I'm coming back because someone thinks they can move pieces on a board without consequences." A faint spark touched his eyes. There it was. Not the waitress. The strategist. The woman who saw 3 steps ahead. The car slowed as it approached a private entrance beneath one of the tallest buildings downtown. Security gates opened without hesitation. Zariah looked down at her uniform one last time. Then she removed the apron from where it had been folded in her lap and placed it carefully on the seat beside her. A relic. Not a disguise anymore. Just a chapter. The car came to a stop. Woo-Jin stepped out first, offering his hand not as a superior, not as a rescuer, but as an equal. She took it. When Zariah stepped onto the pavement, the air felt different, charged, expectant. The men stationed near the entrance straightened subtly as they recognized her. Some had not seen her in years. Some had only heard the name spoken in lowered tones. She did not look back at the street. She did not hesitate at the threshold. The dangerous woman had never disappeared. She had only been waiting for a reason to stand up again. And now she had one.